you've probably heard that algorithms are neutral, that they're just a type of math and that they don't have opinions or biases, but that's totally wrong because there is no such thing as a neutral system. Every system is built by people, and people carry culture, and culture carries power. So today, I'm digging into a question that goes deeper than just discussing bias. Whose existing hierarchies do algorithmic systems reflect, reinforce, and in some cases accelerate? Let's talk about what it actually means to encode power. So Michel Foucault had argued that knowledge and power are completely inseparable. He called it pouvoir savoir, which is power, knowledge. The idea is pretty straightforward, that whoever controls the production of knowledge controls what counts as truth, what gets measured, and who gets left out entirely. Now bring that into the 21st century. Algorithms produce knowledge at a huge scale. They decide what a qualified job candidate looks like. Maybe they determine whether a neighborhood is a credit risk. And they shape which information and what information reaches which communities. So when we say an algorithm encodes power, what we mean is that the assumptions, the categories, and priorities of dominant groups get baked into the system's architecture, and then that system turns around and presents those assumptions as objective outputs, basically as just math or as a neutral experience. And sociologist Patricia Hill-Collins gives us another example of a lens here, and it's very, very useful. Her concept of the matrix of domination describes how race, class, gender, and other systems of power don't operate independently. They actually interlock, which means algorithms reflect that entire matrix all at once, all the time. So one of the clearest ways into this conversation is through the work of Safiya Umoja Noble. She was a researcher at UCLA, and she's the author of Algorithms of Oppression. Her central argument is that search engines, specifically Google, don't neutrally reflect the world. They actually reflect a marketplace. And in that marketplace, the most resourced voices win. When Noble began her research, she was searching for content relevant to Black girls, and what came back was hypersexualized, dehumanizing content. And here's the thing, nobody programmed that in deliberately, based on what we know. It actually happened because the algorithm was optimized for engagement and revenue, and the cultural ecosystem that trained it was already shaped by racial and gendered hierarchies. The bias is structural. It lives in what data was collected, who collected it, and what was considered worth optimizing for, and who had the resources to push their content to the top. Noble's framework asks us a really pointed question. When we say that a search result is relevant to whom? Decided by whom? Optimized for whose cultural baseline? All right, let's move on from the search bar to the safety net. So Virginia Eubanks wrote a book called Automating Inequality, which looks at what happens when algorithmic decision-making tools are being deployed in public services, so like welfare systems, child protective services, homeless services, the systems that disproportionately serve low-income communities and communities of color. And her most striking case involves the Allegheny family, and it was a screening tool that was being used in Pennsylvania. And essentially it pulls data from public systems like Medicaid records, housing assistance, involvement with law enforcement, things like that. And it generates a risk score for child abuse or neglect. Social workers then use that score to determine whether to investigate a family. So Eubanks calls this a digital poorhouse. The poorhouse historically was where surveillance, punishment, and stigma converged for the poor. And the digital version of this does the exact same thing, just at scale, with an interface that makes the whole thing look scientific and objective. And so here's the specific power hierarchy problem. These tools are almost never tested on or deployed for middle class or wealthy families. So a parent struggling with addiction, a family that moves frequently, all those behaviors get read as risk factors when they show up in public data. Wealthier families, they don't really struggle. They get to navigate outside of these systems that feed that algorithm. So what gets reinforced is the idea that poverty itself is a pathology, and that framework has very deep roots in how Western institutions have always categorized and managed the poor. So I want you to sit with that phrase, digital poorhouse, because it's doing a lot of work right there. Old power structures finding new infrastructure. Ruha Benjamin, a sociologist at Princeton, gives us one of the most powerful frameworks in this whole space. She calls it the New Jim Code, which of course is a direct reference to the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation across the American South. And she uses it to describe how new technologies replicate the power hierarchies of old legal and social systems, often while positioning themselves as solutions to those very hierarchies. Her clearest example is facial recognition. Multiple studies, including foundational work by Joy Buolamwini at MIT, have shown that commercial facial recognition systems actually carry significantly higher error rates for darker skinned faces, and especially for darker skinned women. So these systems were trained predominantly on lighter skinned faces, predominantly males as well, because that's what was most represented in the data sets that people had access to. And these tools are being deployed by law enforcement, employers, border agencies. So these are all contexts where an error carries very real consequences, wrongful arrests, job denial, deportation even. And Benjamin's argument is that when technology embeds racial hierarchy into automated systems, it launders discrimination and makes inequality look like a technical output rather than a social choice. And technical outputs are much harder to contest than human decisions. You can challenge a person's judgment. Challenging an algorithm is a different kind of fight. And there's actually a place for this for organizational anthropology. There's a dimension to this that I can talk to. So when a hiring algorithm screens out candidates before a human being ever sees them, the relational dynamics that leader-member exchange theory describes, which are trust, inclusion, perceived incompetence, they never even have a chance to develop. And the hierarchy gets established way before the relationship can even begin. Okay, it's really worth widening the lens here because the power hierarchies encoded in these systems don't stop at the national borders. The communities that are most affected by them are often outside of the West entirely. Content moderation is a very clear example. The major platforms like Meta, YouTube, TikTok moderate content through automated systems and human reviewers that are all working together. Those automated systems were trained predominantly on English language content, so their cultural assumptions run extremely deep. Languages and cultural contexts outside of that training data are systematically undertreated. So there's harmful content that spreads further and legitimate speech that gets caught in filters, really filters that were never designed with those communities in mind at all. And the human side of this is equally revealing. The moderation workforce is largely outsourced to workers in Kenya and the Philippines and parts of Colombia. They are paid significantly less than their global north counterparts, exposed to deeply traumatic content with inadequate psychological support, and they're also operating under content policies that are written by leadership they have no structural power to shape or to even challenge. So this is a global division of labor that dependency theorists like Andre Gunder, Frank, had described decades ago, playing out in real time in front of our eyes on a digital infrastructure. And the cognitive and effective labor of managing the internet's most damaging content falls on the global south. The economic benefit flows platforms in the global north. Power flows up, risk flows down. The algorithm manages the arrangement. So where does this land for organizations, which is where I spend most of my research time? The implications are concrete and they're unfolding right now. Organizations are leaning heavily on algorithmic tools for hiring, performance evaluations, succession planning, even conflict resolution. And the question organizational anthropology keeps pushing back to is whose cultural assumptions are built into these tools and who absorbs the cost when those assumptions are wrong? I know the answer, and it comes from privilege. Think about the systems in place within our own society and who's privileged enough to be there when the data is being created, when the data is being imported. Who are those individuals and what privileges do they have and how does that serve these models and these systems? Think on that. Cultural intelligence, which is the capacity to work effectively across cultural contexts, can't be operationalized by a system that has already decided, based on historical data, what effectiveness even looks like. A performance management system that's trained on data from predominantly Western individualistic societies and organizational cultures will systematically undervalue relational, collectivist, and nonlinear approaches to work, which approaches with their own logic, their own legitimacy, their own track record of results interferes with day-to-day decision-making. This is exactly where the three structural forces in my cultural intelligence triangle converge. There's identity, power, and systems. The algorithm is a system, it reflects power, and it shapes how identity gets read, valued, and rewarded inside institutions. Leaders who are serious about equity have to treat algorithmic tools as something that requires scrutiny the same way any other institutional policy does. Who built it? On what data was it built? With what assumptions was it built? And who in the organization is most likely to be disadvantaged when the system makes a mistake? Thanks for listening. Would love to get your thoughts and comments below. Take care.